Alrighty, folks, let's get started on ethnicity here. We're going to get through this really quickly because, quite frankly, there's not a lot of questions, and ultimately we're going to cover some of this ethnicity next week anyways after the test. Alright? One, what's the major difference between race and ethnicity? Again, race is when you identify with a group of people because of physical features, genetic features, right? The way you look, alright? Skin color, for instance. Ethnicity is when you identify with a group of people because of shared practices, traditions, behavior, usually cultural traditions and behavior. All right? So even though you might not look like everybody in your ethnicity, right, you're still going to practice the same sort of behaviors, the same sort of routines. You still identify with one another. You still consider yourself kind of to be a part of the same cultural or ethnic group. Okay? Again, it helps us to explain why a lot of times we might see folks who have different physical features, like different skin colors in many places, like Brazil or in the Caribbean, right, who we still obviously identify as part of the same ethnicity. Okay? Ethnocentrism, what it is. Ethnocentrism is where your perspective is focused exclusively on your ethnicity. What I mean there is you kind of judge other ethnicities based on your own. Alrighty? It's where you kind of value or think your ethnicity is especially significant or important. Alrighty? And you oftentimes seek to expand your ethnicity over others. Alrighty? Yeah, you could say that. Nazis is a kind of an extreme radical version of ethnocentrism. If I'm just like, man, Hispanics are the bomb, alrighty, and we're gonna take over, and we're gonna be the ones that are dominant later on. That's kind of an ethnocentric view.
Or like the Aryan Brotherhood.
You could say that. Yeah, I think to be honest with you, if you're a cultural imperialist, a lot of times you're ethnocentric, right? Which means your culture you kind of value more than others. You kind of maybe struggle to understand other ethnicities or other cultures because they're hard to compare with you with your own. Alrighty. What's racism? Of course, that's when you have certain biases, stereotypes based on physical differences between you and other people rather than their cultural differences. Alright. Oftentimes that leads to horrific stereotypes and discrimination. Things like, oh, that race is dumber than everybody else, alrighty? Don't trust them because, the color of their skin. People of that color shouldn't be trusted, alright? Yes. Number two, what are the four most common ethnicities inside the United States and where are they distributed? Okay, I'm going to go right to the PowerPoint again because you folks have seen this already. But again, as you can see, we've got Hispanic Americans. Obviously, we know where they're distributed in the American Southwest. Alrighty. Obviously, we've got African Americans. They're our second largest group, our second largest ethnic minority, I should say. They're going to be located in the southern parts of the United States, especially the southeast. Of course, we have Asian Americans. They're our third largest group, about 4% of the population, and they're going to be located on the West Coast for the most part, or they're going to be distributed mostly on the West Coast. And then, of course, Native Americans, American Indians, Eskimos, Aleuts, generally in the western United States, including Alaska, right? Because, of course, of the forest reservation system that we created. Where we pushed many of these natives onto those areas of land. All right, so those are the four most common, and of course where they are distributed, and it went from the largest to the smallest, from Hispanic to Native. Number three, make sure you know the historic and modern reasons why those ethnic minorities are distributed and clustered. Again, historically with Hispanics, right, that area was Spanish, right, was originally controlled by Spain. And then, of course, it's controlled by Mexico, Spanish-speaking countries, right, that really developed Hispanic culture. And so, of course, as a result, they were predominantly Hispanic historically. And now in more recent times, modern times, it has to do with immigration from Central and South America. And so we've seen huge numbers of Hispanics, again, located on our border in the American Southwest. Okay? And there they are, once again. African Americans, again, this had to do with some of the things we've talked about, not only with religion, but also with ethnicity, right? This is a byproduct of the African slave trade, right? Also sharecropping, right, where many blacks then stayed, or I should say African Americans stayed in those southern states after the war, after the Civil War, and they still engaged in farming. Even to this day, right, we see massive distributions of African American ethnic minorities in those locations. Asian Americans, this really has to do more with immigration laws, right? In the 60s, we loosened our immigration laws. Like Hispanics, we allowed way more Asian immigrants in. Alrighty. Secondly, why are they on the West Coast? Well, of course, chain migration. All right. Distance decay as well, right? The closest distance to Asia, the closest location to Asia, is on the Pacific coast. So we see distance decay in action there. Native Americans, we already covered. It really had to do with the reservation system. All right.
And Trail of Tears, right?
Yep, and the Trail of Tears is where we moved some of them originally to the first reservations. Those reservations located here in Oklahoma. Okay. Number 4, explain the 2 major rules of ethnic clustering inside the United States. Well, 1, ethnicities tend to cluster in certain regions of the country. That's rule number 1, right? We just looked at 4 examples of that. Number 2, ethnicities tend to cluster in certain cities, right, in the United States. And then they cluster within particular neighborhoods within those cities. All right? So those are the 2 general rules. Regional distribution, and then city and neighborhood distribution. What's an ethnic neighborhood? Number 5, an ethnic neighborhood, of course, is a neighborhood that was settled exclusively or predominantly by one ethnicity, right? And they brought their cultural and ethnic traditions with them. Oftentimes in these ethnic neighborhoods, you're still going to see a lot of remnants, legacies of those original ethnicities that settled there. That's why we have places like Little Italy, alrighty? That's why we have Greek towns. Sometimes we'll have places like, Chinatown or Little Tokyo as well. Okay. What groups traditionally lived inside ethnic neighborhoods until the 1950s? They were European immigrants. All right. They might be Irish or Germans at first. And then, of course, those immigrant groups were replaced by new European immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, like Poles, like Russians, like Jews, like Italians, like Greeks. All right. And so, oftentimes, we have a number of European ethnic neighborhoods. Maybe some were originally Irish, and then others nearby became other European ethnic neighborhoods as well. Up until about 1950, most ethnic neighborhoods, again, were European. All right? After 1950, what groups have settled in those ethnic neighborhoods? Obviously, the newer ethnic minorities. African Americans are going to finally start to settle in many northern cities. They're going to settle in many of these ethnic neighborhoods because they are available and open as the originals, immigrants, or their descendants moved out. Alrighty. Additionally, as more Hispanic and Asian immigrants entered the country, they too began to fill in some of these ethnic neighborhoods after 1950 as well. Questions? Number 6. Make sure you can describe segregation. Segregation is when races are separated. All right. Now that could either be forced, which means legal separation of the races, where the government actually says the races or ethnicities are going to be divided so that they don't mix, they don't interact with one another. Or folks, that could be what we call de facto, alrighty, or unofficial, voluntary segregation, where people tend to settle in neighborhoods with others of the same ethnicity. Both are examples of segregation. All right. The difference is one is prescribed by the government, one is ordered by the government, whereas the other one is more human nature. Right. It's more aware we do so on our own for comfort. I think for safety, for security, for stability. Okay. What was the separate but equal policy? The separate but equal policy were the laws in those southern states that said, hey, the races have to be separated from one another. Folks, this meant that there were different bathrooms for whites and blacks. This meant that there were different schools, even different lines to wait in, alrighty, when you were waiting to shop at a store. Ultimately, folks, originally, the federal government ruled that separate but equal was legal. Alrighty, the Supreme Court upheld it in a very controversial case. The case was called Plessy versus Ferguson. The Supreme Court said, yeah, that's fine. We'll separate the races. That's okay. That was way back in 1896. Alrighty. In 1954, over 50 years later, the Supreme Court changed that ruling. They overruled separate but equal policies. They said they're unconstitutional, they're unfair, because when you separate races, alrighty, even if you give them the same materials, by separating them, you're telling the kids who have been separated from the whites that they're not the same, that they're inferior in some way. Alright? The Supreme Court case that overturned separate but equal was called Brown versus Board of Education. So again, Plessy v. Ferguson was a Supreme Court case in 1896 that said, yep, the government's going to allow segregation at the time, but about 50 years later, in 1954, in the case of Brown versus Board, the Supreme Court changed its mind, overturned that previous decision, and officially from this point forward, there is no legal segregation in the United States. All right? Now, does it still go on voluntarily, unofficially? Yes, it does. All righty? But technically, you're never going to get a law at the state or federal level that says you have to live separate from these races.
That's what I was going to ask. Like, was there still like segregation even after that?
Absolutely. Yeah. In a way, remember, these neighborhoods that we look at even nowadays today in Anaheim and other places are very much segregated as well. Again, that's de facto, that's optional. Yeah?
Is there a term used to mean the opposite of segregation?
Integration. Alrighty, integration means where everybody is integrated, they're blended together, almost like a big melting pot, alrighty, a big stew. Alrighty, yeah, integration, I-N-T-E, spelled the same way, is the exact opposite of segregation. Thank you, Nathan, wonderful question. Alright. Apartheid was an extreme form of segregation that was practiced in the country of South Africa. South Africa engaged in apartheid all the way until the 1990s. They absolutely separated the races to where there was virtually no contact whatsoever. It was almost like two separate mini nations within the same country. All right. They forced blacks, for instance, to live in certain parts of the country, and really they weren't allowed to come out of these places, these slums, these shanty towns. All righty. Now, what happened was in the 1990s. Certain black South Africans, led by a guy named Nelson Mandela, they fought to overturn these policies. Alrighty, they all went to prison. They went to jail because they were so nonviolent and peaceful in their protests. The rest of the world sympathized with them, and we put so much international pressure on South Africa that eventually they decided on their own to get rid of this system and to support integration as well. When that happened, Nelson Mandela, this man who had led the opposition, became the new president of that country. Alrighty, and if you saw the movie Invictus, with the rugby movie, he plays a huge role in that. Alrighty. Question?
Yeah, well, did Malcolm X do the same thing like Nelson Mandela, or was he different?
Yeah, he was considered to be a more violent civil rights leader. Martin Luther King was very much like Nelson Mandela. Nonviolent, peaceful protest. Alrighty, and by the way, Martin Luther King and Malcolm X led the fight to overturn some of those segregation laws in the South as well. Malcolm X didn't really support nonviolence. He supported ending these policies by any means. If you got to use force to get it done as quickly as possible, then use force. Alrighty, yeah.
What did Gandhi do?
He was nonviolent, peaceful. Hey, he was in India. He tried to give rights to all individuals in India. He also, for instance, tried to overturn the caste system, alrighty, and give more opportunity to women and minorities in that country. All right, very good. Also, I should mention, Gandhi really is most well known, alrighty, for getting Britain out of India and allowing the Indians to self-determine, to represent themselves, to govern themselves.
What religion was he?
He was a Hindu. Yeah, he was a Hindu.
Is that why people consider him a prophet?
Yep. They consider him more almost like a saint-like figure. All right. Now, what's interesting about him? He was not a Brahmin. Remember, he was not one of the people at the top of the caste system. He was, I believe, in like stage 3 or 4. All righty. So he was limited in what he technically, legally, professionally was allowed to achieve. All right. Okay. Let's get to number 7. What is white flight? White flight again is when people of European descent tend to leave neighborhoods. They move out to the suburbs as they gain more wealth. or as more minorities or other ethnicities move into the neighborhood. All right. White flight is a very common practice. It was more common in the 50s, 60s, and 70s because there was a perception, a feeling, unfortunately, amongst many Americans that if minorities entered a neighborhood, that somehow that would lower property values, that somehow that would make the neighborhood less attractive, and so whites would flee or leave that neighborhood to try to head out to suburbs that themselves were oftentimes mostly white as well. Alrighty. It still exists in some extent. For instance, Anaheim in the 60s, 70s was about 95% white, already Caucasian. Today it's closer to 50-50. But if we look at a map of Anaheim, obviously certain suburbs areas on the outside still are dominated by folks of European descent. All right, yeah.
I forgot what was the term, but didn't we learn about this? It was like
Hierarchical diffusion, is that what you mean?
yeah.
It's similar to it, all righty. It's similar to it. I wonder, let's keep going and see if it refreshes your memory here, all right? Redlining. Redlining is where banks and real estate companies, all right, let me turn the lights on here, guys. Banks and real estate companies would basically draw with a marker on a map of a city areas that minorities were not going to be allowed to settle in, all righty? So it was a way to exclude minorities from certain areas in an effort to try to maintain whites in an area, or maybe to try to prevent people from fleeing to the suburbs and taking their wealth with them. Alrighty? It's illegal. Alrighty? Obviously, you cannot discriminate against somebody because of their race or ethnicity and not allow them, for instance, to live where they want to. Alright? Blockbusting is the opposite. Blockbusting was when real estate agents and banks would intentionally sell homes to minorities, alright? Because, of course, they make a profit when they sell that home to that family, right? And then by moving minorities into their neighborhood or into the block, right, then it's going to encourage white flight, and of course the real estate companies and the banks are going to benefit when those white families then buy new homes out in the suburbs, alrighty? So it was an illegal, a kind of unethical, unfair practice that was done by banks and real estate companies so that they would move minorities in order to move whites out so that they could benefit by selling land property to both groups.
So,
Alrighty?
so redlining and blockbusting is like manipulation.
It is manipulation, but you see, it's almost like the opposite of one another, right? Redlining is where you're not going to let minorities into a neighborhood, all right? You almost protect the whites there, all right? You to prevent white flight. Blockbusting is almost is a completely opposite. It's where you move them into a neighborhood to encourage white flight, but they're both
So it's
manipulation.
like continuous cycle.
Exactly right.
Yeah, that's
Exactly.
like pretty smart.
It is. It's business-wise, it's very smart. Now, I'm going to tell you, it's illegal. All righty, the federal government has passed laws recently that say, not even recently, about 25 years ago, hey, you can't do this. This is a civil rights violation. Here's the problem. It's tough to prove. All righty, it's tough to prove that those real estate companies moved those minorities in to block the bus, to bust the block. Because think about it. If they're accused of doing that, a lot of the times they'll just say, wait, what do you mean? I just wanted to increase diversity in the area. There were no families. They wanted that home, and so we sold it to them. Alrighty? So it's sometimes difficult to prove legally. Alright?
When people don't trust real estate.
Right? Just like lawyers and banks, too. Alright? Okay, number 8, what's nationalism? Again, that's pride or loyalty in your nation, right? Remember, in a nation is like an ethnicity, only you also share a same origin, the same land, or a same legal system. Alrighty? And so nationalism is tremendous pride. Remember, nation state we covered today. A nation state is when the boundaries of an ethnicity, of a nation, of a group of people, correspond to the country's boundaries as well. Alright? It's good for unity. Alrighty? It's great for bringing a country together if everybody's kind of the same ethnicity. It sometimes leads to a lot of ethnocentrism, right? Because there's not a lot of diversity in those places, alrighty? And so a lot of times it can lead to nation states maybe declaring war against other countries in an effort to try to expand, or if they have members of their nation that are separated from them, they might declare war to try to reach those people to make them part of the country as well, alrighty? Who does balkanization affect? Okay, balkanization, all right, is when a country, folks, has different ethnicities in it, and those ethnicities are not loyal to the central government, all right? Why do we call it balkanization? Because the part of Europe where Yugoslavia is located is called the Balkan Peninsula, All righty, remember